Jerusalem. It was here, in the heart of the Middle Ages, that the first Knights Templar emerged. At the time, only a handful of knights, nearly destitute. But all are of great piety and have been trained in combat. Sworn to dedicate their lives to a new cause, the protection of the Holy Land and of the Christian pilgrims who come there to worship. To understand the origins of their existence, we must go back to the end of the 11th century. At the time, the religious world was divided. In the West, the vast majority of Europe was under the authority of the Christian Church and the Pope. Islam dominates North Africa, southern Spain, and the Near East, while the Turks threaten the Byzantine Empire and its capital, Constantinople, territory of the Orthodox Church. With Pope Urban II's call to action, the First Crusade witnessed thousands of Christians marching across Europe to reconquer the Holy Land. The First Crusade gave birth to the Crusader states, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. At the dawn of the 12th century, the security of these Crusader states, threatened from all sides, rested on only a few knights of very diverse backgrounds who chose to settle there.
The challenge facing those who remain in the East after the First Crusade is to try and turn their fairly small territorial gains into permanent territories that can last in the long term. From a military perspective, they have enemies in Damascus who can raise armies of several thousand troops, and in Aleppo, a slightly larger army, and also Fatimid Egypt, which can raise about 15,000 troops. Now, given that the Crusader states, at least in their early years, can't put together more than a few hundred knights with a slightly larger contingent of infantry, that's a very serious challenge.
In Jerusalem, Christian pilgrimage is on the rise and is organized by the authorities of the Holy City, the King of Jerusalem, the Latin Patriarch at the head of the Church, and the canons of the Holy Sepulchre, which govern religious life in the city.
The Holy Sepulchre is the church that is located at the site of both the crucifixion and the burial of Christ. It's a church that attracted Christian veneration early on, and therefore it's the Holy Sepulchre which happens to be the main church of Jerusalem.
Pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem were under constant threat of guerrilla raids from ambushes. So all pilgrims arriving in Jerusalem could be attacked in the vicinity or near the holy city. The outskirts of this holy land were by no means safe.
At the time, the Knights Templar didn't yet exist. The soldiers charged with the safety of the pilgrims were called the Milites Sancti Sepulchri, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. Among these Milites Sancti Sepulchri, one knight will claim his independence. His goal is to form a more powerful group, a hybrid order which no one had ever dared to imagine before. Soldiers of a new kind, both religious and warrior. This knight is the founder of what will much later be known as the Order of the Temple. Hugh de Pin, born in the Champagne region around 1070, in a small village that he's named after, located 12 kilometers from the city of Troyes. He's a knight in the service of Count Hugh of Champagne. With his suzerain, Hugh de Pin will spend 3 years in the Holy Land at the beginning of the 12th century, before returning to Europe.
Hugh de Pin led a family life. He had a wife and children. And then in 1114, touched by a deep piety that must have inhabited him for a long time, he went back to the Holy Land. And this time he left with the idea that he would never come back.
Hugues de Pin is a military strategist, a defender of the Holy Land. He truly experienced what Jerusalem was, and it must have been a revelation for him. In Jerusalem, one could not be a knight like any other. One could only be a knight turned towards God, towards the service of Christ. So this idea must have germinated when he arrived in Jerusalem.
Over several years, Hugues de Pin refined his project. And in 1119, one event will change his destiny. On June the 28th, 1119, Muslims of the city of Aleppo attacked the Principality of Antioch. The intensity of the fighting will be of such violence that the event will be baptized in Latin as the Agea Sanguinis, the Battle of the Field of Blood. It is Baldwin II, the new king of Jerusalem, who will come in person to repel the invaders. This battle reinforced the sovereign's belief that the threat to the Crusader states was becoming too great.
The new king, Baldwin II, realized that he needed more military presence than he had on the ground. He needed border guards, escorts on the roads to protect the pilgrims. He needed additional forces.
It was on January the 16th, 1120, in the small city of Nablus, north of Jerusalem, that a council was to take place that would change the course of history. Assembled around the king of Jerusalem, Baldwin II and the patriarch Gontmond de Piquigny, the council brought together the main clergymen and nobles of the kingdom. On that day, the two men approved the project conceived by Hugues de Pin, the formation of a new order of knights, both religious and military, dedicated entirely to the defense of the Holy Land.
King Baldwin II made a very strong gesture by offering his palace to them in Jerusalem. Baldwin's palace actually extended south of the esplanade of the mosques, south of the Temple Mount. It extended into the area of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the former palace of King Solomon. And so Hugues de Pin and his associates somehow took on the name by association, by calling themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon.
The Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. Later, this name will be shortened, and the group will become one of the most significant orders in all history, the Order of the Temple. Faced with the ongoing conflicts in the Holy Land, the members of this new brotherhood must now find a way to grow.
The Templars in the 1120s, if they were going to expand, what they really needed was troops, high-quality recruits, money, and land in Western Europe that would supply them with the resources they need to carry on their vocation.
Hugues de Pin decides to return to Europe to embark on a vast recruitment and fundraising operation.
He went from country to country, France, Champagne, Flanders, England, to try to recruit and promote his project.
As an agent seeking crusaders for the King of Jerusalem, he went into all the major courts of Western Europe. People began to get curious about who he was, what his order was trying to achieve, and when they found out, they were immensely impressed and began to offer huge sums of money, large numbers of donations to the Templar order, so much so that it became very, very wealthy very, very quickly.
Once the donations of land and money and so on came in, that's when they were able to train men up to fight. A medieval knight was the equivalent of, modern-day tank or something, just like a fully armed knight on a war horse. It was quite an awesome figure to behold, you needed to run. So these were, the elite troops, the crack troops, the special forces of the 12th century.
It was at this time the first symbols of recognition of the Templars were born, on which their legend of outstanding fighters would gradually be built.
The initial knights weren't visually, impressive to start with. They were called the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, and they were literally poor. They had nothing, just the clothes they stood up in and their swords and a few horses. So after the Council of Troyes, you get massive donations of land and money, and all of a sudden they become vastly wealthy. So the white surcoat is part of this new look. We would call it maybe a rebranding, but to a medieval person, white would symbolize purity.
This long white mantle with the red cross on it is precisely the mark of the commitment that was made, since this red cross recalls the blood shed by Christ for the redemption of humanity, and therefore the commitment of a brother of the temple, in his turn, to lay down his life and shed his blood to defend the land of Christ and the kingdom of Jerusalem.
The mission of the Knights Templar is to defend the Holy Land. They must therefore not only know how to fight, but also how to make new weapons, organize their movements, and build strongholds to defend pilgrims. And thanks to the donations, the Order of the Temple recruits. Gradually, Templar houses called commanderies were created in Western Europe. The brothers lived there by scrupulously respecting the guidelines of the temple by pursuing only one mission: to prepare to fight in the East and to grow the wealth of the order to finance the Holy War. But while the Templar enterprise is developing quickly in the West, in the East, the situation in the Crusader states has deteriorated. Defeated in Damascus in 1129, in Bahrain in 1137, in Tequa in 1139, and especially in Edessa in 1144, where it's said that 30,000 Christians were massacred. The failures of the Crusaders mount one after another.
These were not the setbacks of the Templars. These were the setbacks of the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which were starting to integrate within it perhaps a few dozen Templars. But these setbacks were bitter. The Templars still lacked influence within the army, and the qualities of order and discipline that we know of them were not really imposed.
In the face of these defeats and the threat to Christians in the East, Pope Eugene III decided to act. With the papal bull Quantum Predecessoris, he called for a new crusade. Bernard de Clairvaux himself is in charge of mobilizing the population. On March the 31st, 1146, at Vézelay in Burgundy, he preached the journey to the Holy Land by promising to those who would take up the cross the absolution of all sins. Among the many sovereigns from all over Europe who joined the Second Crusade was Louis VII, King of France, and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. And to help in their endeavor, they turned to those with sufficient means: the Knights Templar.
In 1147, Louis VII requested funding from the Order of the Temple, and he entrusted them for the first time with his treasure. So they already have resources that can help the sovereign with his crusade, arming ships, etc. These are the Templars who served as scouts, protectors, guides along the road. And the crusade route is very challenging for Louis VII. They suffered very harsh Turkish attacks, and it was the Knights of the Temple, led by their Marshal Evar de Bar, who will become Grand Master, who saved the royal army.
Louis VII is not the only one to embark on the Second Crusade. Conrad III, King of Germany, also made his way to the Holy Land with nearly 20,000 men at his side. But from the first months of combat, the armies of the two kings suffered great setbacks against the Muslims. Mount Cadmos, Doriley, Inab. Defeats follow one after another, and the deaths pile up. Financing these losing battles is beginning to cost the two kings dearly. So to find the necessary money, Louis VII needs help. He will turn once again to his new allies, the Knights Templar.
When the Crusade gets into difficulty in 1148, Louis turns to the master of the temple and says, "Can you help us?" So the Templars, the Grand Master goes off in his ship and gets the money from a Templar stronghold. This is like the first time we can see the Templars acting effectively as bankers, supporting European kings. They're not just supporting the interests of the church and fighting for Christ and defending souls, but they are now, by the time of the Second Crusade, also financially very powerful and literally funding the crusade.
Despite financial assistance from the Knights Templar, the troops of the King of France, the King of Germany, were unable to recover any territory from their enemies. After 3 years of fighting, the two sovereigns give up. A crusade for nothing, which will nevertheless benefit the Order of the Temple.
The Second Crusade was a total failure. It ended with nothing at all. Mostly because the presence of Conrad III and the King of France revealed to be a problem. They disagreed on almost everything. They made all the possible wrong choices, like taking the siege of Damascus, who ended up badly for the King of France with a lot of money spent. He had to ask for money to the Templars in order to go back to France. The defeat of the Second Crusade probably helped the Templars. They had lended money to the king. They were the forces that truly ended well in the local situation.
The Knights Templar had shown, both by loaning money to the King of France and also reorganising his army at one stage, they had shown how effective that they could be, and this would not be forgotten by the Kings of France in the future.
The Second Crusade will be a resounding military failure, and Louis VII returns to France in 1149, greatly weakened financially and diplomatically. However, his ordeal contributes to the growth of the legend of the Knights Templar.
He came back from the Holy Land with a lofty idea of what the Knights of the Temple were like. For him, this is an order that shines over the whole surface of the earth and which has no equivalent in his mind. And he will not cease to give them income and money from his tax revenues. He cedes to them the Villa Savigny, which will become the great commandery of Savigny-le-Temple. So this is a king who shows the same fascination of the sovereigns for the beginnings of the Order of the Temple, since it is less than 30 years after its creation, and the King of France is truly an unconditional supporter of the Knights of the Temple.
During the Second Crusade, the Templars were able to supply their own contingent to go on crusade. Whilst continuing their work in the Crusade estates, they were also able to afford a series of massive loans to the King of France to support the King of France's crusade to the Holy Land. By the end of the 12th century, the Templars had become a substantial international organisation. We don't know precisely how many members they had, but it seems likely that they would have had about 600 fighting brother knights in the Crusade estates, but then with a much larger substantial contingent of infantry and other employees and followers. In Western Europe, they would have had an equally, possibly even larger number of brother knights, brother sergeants, and other personnel, all there to facilitate the supply of resources to the Holy Land.
The Templars developed this reputation for avarice, but I think what was really going on was they were just very good businessmen.
At the beginning of the second half of the 12th century, the Order of the Temple will become more and more powerful. Supported by popes and kings, the order accumulates considerable wealth, building commanderies in the west and castles in the east. Its ranks will not cease to grow. The reign of these new Knights of Christ was only beginning.